the morning light filtered through my kitchen window, the same way it had for the past 3 years, casting familiar shadows across the empty chair where Emma used to sit. Her favorite mug still lived in the cabinet above the sink, untouched since that Tuesday in October when everything changed. I'd grown accustomed to the weight of absence, the way silence filled the spaces where her laughter once echoed. But some mornings the quiet still pressed against my chest like a physical thing. I was 42 when I became a mother, and Emma arrived like a gift I'd stopped believing I deserved. She came into the world with eyes that seemed to hold secrets, dark and knowing, and from her first breath, she lived with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified me. Other children played house or pretended to be princesses, but Emma collected rocks and whispered to stray cats, convinced she could understand their stories. She wore her grandmother's antique necklace everywhere, a delicate silver chain with a small locket that held a pressed violet from my mother's garden. Emma claimed it made her brave. The accident happened on a rainy Thursday in October. Emma was 16, driving herself home from her job at the local animal shelter, where she volunteered every afternoon. She'd been so proud when she finally got her license, begging me for months to let her drive alone. I'd resisted at first, that maternal instinct whispering warnings I couldn't quite name. But Emma had a way of wearing down my fears with her quiet determination and that smile that reminded me so much of my mother. The police officer who came to my door was young, probably not much older than Emma herself. His uniform looked too big on his narrow frame, and he kept fidgeting with his hat as he struggled to find words that could somehow make sense of the senseless. A drunk driver had run a red light. Emma hadn't suffered, he assured me, though I wondered how he could possibly know that. The other driver walked away with barely a scratch, a cosmic injustice that would gnaw at me for months to come. The funeral was a blur of faces and flowers, people speaking in hushed tones about God's plan, and Emma being in a better place. I nodded and accepted their condolences, but inside I felt like I was drowning in a sea of platitudes that meant nothing. Emma wasn't in a better place. She belonged here, with me, arguing about curfew and leaving her textbooks scattered across the dining room table. She belonged in this world that suddenly seemed colorless without her presence. The weeks that followed moved like molasses. Well-meaning friends brought casseroles and offered to help with arrangements, but I found myself craving solitude. I spent hours in Emma's room, sitting on her unmade bed, breathing in the faint scent of her vanilla perfume that still clung to her pillowcase. Her things remained exactly as she'd left them. Homework half finished on her desk, art supplies scattered across her dresser, that collection of smooth river stones she'd gathered over the years lined up on her windowsill, like tiny monuments to her curiosity. It was during one of these vigils that I first noticed the necklace was missing. I'd been going through her jewelry box, touching each piece as if I could somehow feel her through the metal and stones, when I realized the one thing that mattered most wasn't there. Emma never took off that necklace. It had been my mother's, and before that, my grandmother's. The locket itself was old, probably from the 1920s, engraved with tiny roses around the edges that had worn smooth with age. Inside, Emma had kept that pressed violet, alongside a small photo of the two of us from her 15th birthday. I tore through her room looking for it, checking under the bed, in coat pockets, anywhere she might have placed it for safekeeping. My search expanded to the rest of the house, then to her car, which had been towed to a junkyard across town. The manager there, a gruff man with oil-stained hands, let me search through the wreckage that had once been Emma's little Honda. The front end was completely destroyed, the dashboard pushed back into where the passenger seat had been, but I crawled through the debris anyway, cutting my hands on twisted metal as I searched for that small piece of silver. The necklace was nowhere to be found. The police report mentioned that Emma's personal effects had been collected at the scene, but when I requested them, the necklace wasn't among her belongings. Just her wallet, her phone with its cracked screen, and a library book about marine biology that was due the following week. I called the hospital, the towing company, even the funeral home, but no one had seen it. It was as if the necklace had simply vanished, taking with it the last tangible connection to 3 generations of women who had worn it before Emma. The loss of the necklace felt like losing her all over again. I knew it was irrational. Emma was gone, and no piece of jewelry could change that. But somehow, that missing necklace became the focus of all my grief. I couldn't save my daughter, but I should have been able to find this one small thing that had meant so much to her. In my darkest moments, I wondered if losing it was my punishment for not holding tight enough to what mattered most. As the months passed, I learned to function in my new reality. I returned to work at the accounting firm where I'd been employed for over a decade, grateful for the mind-numbing routine of numbers and spreadsheets that required no emotional investment. My colleagues treated me with careful kindness, speaking in gentle tones and avoiding mention of children or families. I appreciated their consideration, but their tiptoeing also served as a constant reminder of how fundamentally I had changed. I was no longer Sarah the working mother, Sarah who talked about her daughter's latest art project or college plans. I was simply Sarah the woman whose daughter died, an identity that felt both foreign and inescapable. The seasons turned without my notice. Winter snow covered Emma's grave. Spring rain fell on the headstone I'd chosen with its simple inscription, "Beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." Summer came and went, and with it, the anniversary of what would have been Emma's 17th birthday. I'd planned to visit the animal shelter where she'd volunteered, maybe make a donation in her memory. But when the day arrived, I found myself unable to leave the house. Instead, I spent the day organizing and reorganizing her room, as if the perfect arrangement of her belongings might somehow bring her back. It was during this period, roughly 18 months after the accident, that I began having the dreams. They always started the same way. I'd see Emma walking ahead of me, always just out of reach, wearing her favorite sundress and that silver necklace glinting in sunlight. I'd call out to her, but she never turned around. Instead, she'd keep walking, her hand occasionally rising to touch the locket at her throat, until she'd disappear around a corner or fade into a crowd of people I didn't recognize. I'd wake from these dreams with my heart racing. The phantom image of that necklace burned into my vision like an after-image from staring at the sun. 7 years. 7 years of existing in a world that had lost its color, where every sunrise felt like an accusation and every sunset like a small mercy that brought me closer to the end of another day without her. I had tried everything the grief counselors suggested. Support groups where people shared their losses in voices that never quite reached above a whisper. Therapy sessions where I stared at the ceiling and counted the tiny holes in the acoustic tiles, rather than talk about the gaping hole in my chest. Even medication that was supposed to dull the sharp edges of my pain, but only seemed to wrap everything in a gray fog that made me feel like I was viewing my own life through frosted glass. Sarah had tried to help. God knows she had. For the first 2 years, she'd brought me meals I didn't eat, sat with me through the silence of television shows I didn't watch, and held me when the waves of grief crashed over me so hard I couldn't breathe. But grief is a selfish beast, and mine had consumed everything in its path. I watched my wife disappear piece by piece, like she was being erased by my inability to find my way back to the living. She never said it was my fault that Emma died, but I could see it in her eyes sometimes. The question of what might have been different if I had just paid attention, if I had just been the father Emma deserved. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in late fall, delivered by a courier who apologized for the inconvenience, as if he were simply bringing a package that had been delayed in shipping. Sarah had moved out 3 months earlier, taking with her the last remnants of the life we'd built together. The coffee maker that gurgled every morning at 7:15. The throw pillows she'd insisted would brighten up the living room. The family photos that had become too painful for either of us to look at. The house felt like a mausoleum after she left, every room echoing with conversations that would never happen again, and laughter that had died along with our daughter. I found myself driving past Emma's school sometimes, watching children pour out of the building at dismissal time, their backpacks bouncing as they ran toward waiting cars and buses. I'd sit in my car across the street, searching their faces for something familiar, some echo of my daughter in their expressions or their movements. It was torture, but it was also the only time I felt close to her anymore. The dreams had begun to fade by then, becoming less frequent and more fragmented, until sometimes I'd wake up knowing I'd seen her, but unable to remember what she'd said or how she'd looked. I was terrified that I was forgetting her, that the sharp clarity of her memory was softening around the edges like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. Work became my refuge, the only place where I could lose myself in something that demanded complete attention. I'd always been a carpenter, but after Emma died, I threw myself into projects with an intensity that worried my business partner, Jake. I'd work 16-hour days, building custom cabinets and intricate trim work that required such precision that there was no room in my mind for anything else. The smell of sawdust and the weight of tools in my hands became my meditation, the only time when the constant ache in my chest subsided to something manageable. Jake would find me in the workshop at midnight, still sanding a piece of oak or adjusting the joints on a cabinet door, and he'd just shake his head and leave a thermos of coffee on my workbench without saying anything. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I started building Emma's room again. Not literally. Sarah and I had converted her bedroom into a guest room before she moved out, packing away the stuffed animals and soccer trophies and artwork in boxes that now sat in the garage, like archaeological evidence of a life that had been lived too briefly. But in the workshop, working with my hands in the quiet hours after midnight, I began recreating pieces of her world. I built a perfect replica of her white wooden desk, complete with the small drawer that had always stuck, and the corner where she'd carved her initials with a stolen knife from the kitchen. I reconstructed her bookshelf, measuring from memory the exact spacing of the shelves to accommodate her collection of Harry Potter books and horse stories, and the journal with the unicorn on the cover, where she'd written her secrets in purple ink. Each piece I built was an act of remembrance, a way of keeping her present in a world that seemed determined to move on without her. I'd run my hands over the smooth wood and imagine her small fingers tracing the same paths, her voice asking if she could help even though she was too young to use most of the tools safely. She'd loved watching me work, perching on a stool in the corner of the garage workshop, chattering about her day at school or her plans for the weekend, while I measured and cut and assembled whatever project had captured my imagination. Her favorite thing was when I let her hold the flashlight while I worked in the dim corners of a piece, and she'd move the beam of light like she was conducting an orchestra, always managing to illuminate exactly what I needed to see. The years blurred together in a haze of sawdust and solitude. I moved through my days like a ghost haunting his own life, going through the motions of normalcy while feeling completely disconnected from the world around me. Friends stopped calling after a while, tired of my inability to engage in conversations about anything that didn't somehow circle back to Emma. My sister would visit occasionally, bringing casseroles and forced cheerfulness, but even she eventually gave up trying to pull me back into the land of the living. I existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor completely dead, just marking time until something, anything, would give my life meaning again. The workshop became my sanctuary and my prison. I'd built dozens of pieces over the years, each one more elaborate than the last, as if complexity could somehow fill the simple, devastating absence of my daughter. Clients would come to see my work and leave shaking their heads in amazement at the level of detail, the way every joint was perfectly flush and every surface polished to a mirror finish. They didn't understand that perfection was the only way I could function anymore, that anything less than absolute precision felt like another way of failing Emma. If I couldn't protect her life, I could at least honor her memory with work that would last longer than any of us. It was on a Thursday morning in late spring, almost exactly 7 years after the accident, that everything changed. I was at the farmer's market downtown, something I'd started doing recently, on Jake's insistence that I needed to get out of the house more often. I wasn't really shopping, just walking through the crowds of people, examining produce and baked goods, when I saw her. A young woman, maybe 25, with long brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, was bent over a display of handmade jewelry. She was wearing a simple blue dress and sandals, and she was laughing at something the vendor had said. But it wasn't her laugh that stopped me cold. It was what was hanging around her neck, Emma's necklace, the silver locket with the tiny engraved rose on the front, hanging from the delicate chain that had belonged to my mother and her mother before her. I could see it clearly even from 30 feet away, catching the morning sunlight exactly the way it had when Emma wore it to school. That last day, my legs felt like they might give out beneath me, and I had to reach for a nearby table to steady myself. The woman straightened up, still talking to the jewelry vendor, and the locket settled against her chest, exactly where it had always rested against Emma's. Every detail was identical. The way the chain kinked slightly near the clasp, where Emma had tangled it with her soccer medal, the small dent on the left side where she'd dropped it, on the bathroom tile, the particular way it caught and reflected light. It was impossible, but there it was, hanging around the neck of a complete stranger, as if it had always belonged to her. I stood frozen in that bustling marketplace, people flowing around me like water around a stone, while my entire world narrowed to that silver chain catching the afternoon light. My coffee had gone cold in my hand, but I couldn't feel anything except the thundering of my heart against my ribs. This wasn't another dream. I could smell the kettle corn from the vendor 2 stalls over, hear the bluegrass band tuning their instruments near the fountain, feel the concrete beneath my feet. This was real, impossibly real, and Emma's necklace was right there, 30 feet away, moving with the gentle sway of a stranger's breathing. The young woman was examining a display of handmade soaps, her dark hair falling forward as she leaned down to smell a lavender bar. She couldn't have been more than 25, with olive skin and graceful hands that reminded me nothing of Emma. Yet there was something in the way she moved, a careful deliberateness, as if she was always thinking one step ahead. When she straightened up and tucked that strand of hair behind her ear, the locket shifted against her collarbone, and I had to grip the edge of a nearby table to keep myself steady. I tried to tell myself I was wrong, that grief had finally driven me to see things that weren't there. After all, how many silver lockets existed in the world? Thousands, maybe millions. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, I knew with absolute certainty that this was Emma's necklace. A father doesn't forget the jewelry he fastened around his daughter's neck every Christmas morning, the pendant she worried between her fingers during math tests, the chain she twisted when she was nervous about asking a boy to the school dance. I had watched her wear that necklace every single day for 3 years, had seen it catch the light in exactly this way 1,000 times before. My legs felt unsteady as I forced myself to move closer. I weaved between other shoppers, my vision tunneling until everything except her became background noise. The soap vendor was explaining something about essential oils, but the young woman's attention seemed elsewhere, her fingers absently tracing the outline of the locket through her thin cotton shirt. It was such a familiar gesture that for a moment I could have sworn I was watching Emma herself, transported somehow from that terrible day 4 years ago into this strange new life. "Excuse me," I heard myself say, though my voice sounded foreign and far away. The young woman looked up, and I found myself staring into warm brown eyes that held no recognition, no understanding of the storm that was raging inside me. She smiled politely, the kind of pleasant expression you give to strangers in public places, and waited for me to continue. "I'm sorry to bother you," I managed, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "That necklace you're wearing, it's very beautiful. May I ask where you got it? Something flickered across her face, quick as a shadow passing over the sun. Her hand moved instinctively to the locket, her fingers closing around it in a protective gesture that made my chest ache with the memory of Emma doing the exact same thing whenever anyone commented on her jewelry. "This old thing?" she said, and her voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, something that suggested English wasn't her first language. "I've had it for so long, I honestly can't remember. Why do you ask?" The lie fell between us like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of tension that I could feel even through my emotional haze. She was gripping the necklace now, her knuckles white against the silver chain, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there moments before. Wariness, maybe even fear. She took a small step backward, putting the soap display between us as if it could serve as a barrier against whatever she saw in my face. "I had a daughter," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "She died 4 years ago in a car accident. She wore a necklace exactly like that one, and My voice cracked, the careful composure I'd built over years of grief therapy crumbling in an instant. "I'm sorry. I know this sounds crazy, but that looks exactly like her necklace, the one she was buried in." The young woman's face went very pale, her free hand reaching out to steady herself against the soap vendor's table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the market continued around us. Children laughing, dogs barking, the distant melody of the bluegrass band. But we existed in a bubble of silence that felt both fragile and impenetrable. "I think you must be mistaken," she said finally. But her voice lacked conviction. "There are probably many necklaces like this one. I'm sure yours was special, but the clasp is loose on the left side," I interrupted, my heart hammering so hard I was sure she could hear it. "There's a small dent near the bottom of the locket from when it was dropped on a tile floor, and if you open it, there's an inscription on the inside that says, 'For my beautiful Emma, love always, Dad.'" The effect of my words was immediate and devastating. The young woman's eyes went wide, her face draining of all color until she looked like she might faint. She stumbled backward, bumping into another shopper, her hand still clutched around the necklace, as if she was afraid I might try to take it from her. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered, and in that whisper I heard something that made my blood run cold. Guilt, recognition, and underneath it all, a terror that suggested she knew exactly how impossible this situation was. "You can't know that. You can't." The coffee shop she led me to was a small place tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, the kind of establishment that survived on atmosphere rather than foot traffic. She'd barely spoken during the 10-minute walk, just nodded when I asked if we could talk somewhere private, her fingers never leaving the necklace. I watched her order, black coffee, 2 sugars, and noticed how her hands shook as she counted out exact change, as if this mundane transaction might somehow ground her in reality. We found a corner table away from the handful of other customers, and I studied her face in the better light. She was probably in her early 20s, with dark hair that fell in waves around her shoulders, and eyes that held an old sadness I recognized all too well. There was something familiar about her features that I couldn't place, a nagging sense of recognition that went beyond just seeing her at the market. "My name is David," I said finally, wrapping my hands around my coffee cup to keep them from trembling. "David Chen, and I need you to tell me how you have my daughter's necklace." She took a shaky sip of her coffee, wincing as if she'd burned her tongue. "I'm Sarah," she said quietly. "Sarah Morrison. And I don't know how to explain this to you. I don't know how to explain it to myself." The way she said her name triggered something in my memory, a half-remembered conversation from years ago, but I couldn't quite grasp it. "Just start at the beginning," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle despite the urgency clawing at my chest. "However you got it, whatever happened, I need to know." She looked down at the necklace, her thumb tracing the outline of the locket through her shirt. "I've had this since I was 7 years old," she said, It was given to me after my parents died in a car accident. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the world tilt sideways. Car accident. 7 years old. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that my mind refused to accept, even as my heart began to race with a possibility too incredible to believe. Sarah Morrison, I repeated slowly, and suddenly I remembered where I'd heard that name before. The other family, the other car. The family in the sedan that had taken the full impact when the drunk driver ran the red light. A mother, a father, and their 7-year-old daughter who had been rushed to the hospital with critical injuries. I'd been so consumed with my own grief, my own loss, that I'd barely processed the fact that there had been other victims that night. "You were in the other car," I whispered. She nodded, tears beginning to fall. "My parents died on impact. I was in the back seat and I almost died too. I was in the hospital for months. Broken ribs, internal bleeding, brain injury. I don't remember much from that time, just fragments. But when I woke up, really woke up, and could think clearly again, this necklace was around my neck. The social worker said it had been found at the scene, that they assumed it belonged to me. I stared at her, my mind reeling. "But it wasn't yours. I tried to tell them," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried to say it wasn't mine, that I'd never seen it before. But I was just a kid, and I was confused and traumatized. And they said sometimes after accidents like that, children forget things, that the brain trauma might have affected my memory. They said it was probably a gift from my parents that I'd forgotten about, something they'd given me before the accident." My hand moved instinctively to my chest, to where my own heart was hammering against my ribs. The night of the accident came flooding back with crystal clarity. Emma getting ready for her sleepover, running back upstairs at the last minute because she'd forgotten something. The necklace. She'd forgotten the necklace. "She ran back for it," I said, more to myself than to Sarah. "She always wore it to sleepovers. Said it helped her not feel homesick. If we hadn't gone back for it, if we'd just left 5 minutes earlier." "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. All these years I've been wearing something that belonged to your daughter, and I had no idea. But I was shaking my head, because something else was becoming clear, a connection that went beyond mere coincidence. The EMTs," I said slowly. "When they pulled you from the wreckage, you must have been—" The cars were so close together after the impact. "Emma was thrown from our car, and you—" Understanding dawned in her eyes. "We were lying next to each other," she finished. "Weren't we? At the scene?" I nodded, remembering now what one of the paramedics had told me later, a detail that had seemed unimportant at the time. 2 children, he'd said, lying unconscious in the debris between the vehicles. They'd worked on both Emma and Sarah simultaneously, their small bodies side by side on the asphalt. Emma had been wearing the necklace when we'd gotten in the car, but in the chaos of the accident, in the twisted metal and broken glass, it had somehow transferred to Sarah. "The chain must have broken during the impact," I said, working through the mechanics of it in my mind. "And somehow, in all the confusion, it ended up around your neck instead." Sarah's face was wet with tears now, and she was clutching the necklace so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "I should give it back to you," she said. "It's not mine. It was never mine." But as I looked at her, at this young woman who had survived the same accident that killed my daughter, who had been wearing Emma's necklace for 15 years without knowing its true origin, I felt something unexpected stirring in my chest. Not anger or resentment, but something else entirely, a sense of connection, of purpose, that I hadn't felt since the day Emma died. "Sarah," I said carefully, "can I ask you something? The necklace, has it helped you at all? Over the years?" She looked confused by the question. "Helped me. Has it brought you comfort? Made you feel less alone?" She considered this, her thumb still tracing the outline of the locket. Yes, actually." I know it sounds silly, but sometimes when things got really bad, when I was in foster care, when I aged out of the system, when I felt like I had nobody, I would hold on to it and it would make me feel like maybe I wasn't completely alone in the world. Like maybe there was someone watching over me. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but for the first time in 15 years, they weren't tears of pure grief. Emma used to say the same thing, I told her. She said the necklace was like having a guardian angel with her wherever she went. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible coincidence and unexpected grace. Here was a girl who had survived the same accident that killed my daughter, who had been carrying Emma's protective talisman all these years without knowing it. A girl who was alone in the world, just as Emma would have been if I had been the one to die that night. I don't think this is an accident, I said finally. Finding you here, seeing the necklace again after all these years. I don't think any of this is random. Sarah looked at me with eyes that held hope and fear in equal measure. What do you mean? I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over hers, the one that was still clutching the necklace. I think maybe Emma wanted me to find you, I said. I think maybe she's been taking care of you all this time, and now she wants me to take care of you too. The weeks that followed our meeting at the coffee shop felt like walking through a dream, where grief and joy existed in the same space, where healing happened not through forgetting, but through remembering in a completely different way. Sarah and I began meeting regularly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for walks in the park where Emma used to play, sometimes just sitting on a bench watching the world go by while we shared stories about the girl who had somehow brought us together. I learned that Sarah had been struggling with anxiety and depression for years before meeting Emma that day. She'd been walking to a bridge, she told me one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper, planning to end her own pain. Emma had appeared beside her like an angel, chattering about school and soccer, and how her dad always made the best pancakes on Sunday mornings. Sarah said Emma had this way of talking that made you forget whatever darkness was chasing you, this infectious laugh that seemed to pull light from thin air. She walked with me for 3 blocks, Sarah remembered, her fingers tracing the edges of the locket. 3 blocks away from that bridge, talking the whole time about how she was going to be a veterinarian when she grew up, how she wanted to save all the stray cats in the neighborhood. And then, right before we reached the crosswalk where Sarah's voice caught, and I reached for her hand. Right before we reached the crosswalk, she stopped and took off this necklace. She said it was her good luck charm, but that I looked like I needed some good luck more than she did. I could picture Emma doing exactly that. She'd always been the kind of child who gave away her lunch money to classmates who forgot theirs, who brought home wounded birds, and insisted we nurse them back to health. The fact that her final conscious act had been one of such pure generosity didn't surprise me, but it broke my heart in an entirely new way. She made me promise to wear it, Sarah continued. She said promises were sacred things, and that as long as I kept wearing it, good things would find their way to me. She was so serious about it, this little girl with pigtails and grass stains on her knees, talking about promises like she was ancient and wise. Sarah laughed through her tears. I thought she was just being dramatic the way kids are, but I promised anyway. And then she ran ahead to cross the street in that truck. We sat in silence for a long time after that, both of us crying quietly while the world continued around us. I understood now why Emma had given Sarah the necklace, why she'd spent those precious minutes talking a stranger away from despair. My daughter had saved a life that day, even as her own was about to end. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable, but it was also transformative. As the months passed, I watched Sarah slowly begin to heal in ways I hadn't thought possible. She started volunteering at the animal shelter, inspired by Emma's dream of becoming a veterinarian. She enrolled in night classes to finish her degree. She began painting again, something she said she hadn't done since high school. The necklace seemed to give her courage, but I began to realize that the courage had been inside her all along, Emma had simply helped her remember it was there. For my part, having Sarah in my life gave my grief a new shape. Instead of being this consuming black hole that threatened to swallow everything good I'd ever known, it became something more like a garden where beautiful things could grow alongside the sorrow. I started talking about Emma again. Really talking. Not just the painful, careful conversations I'd had with therapists and well-meaning friends. With Sarah, I could share the funny stories, the proud moments, the ordinary Tuesday evenings that had made up the bulk of our life together. I told her about how Emma used to narrate everything she was doing in the third person when she was getting ready for school. Emma brushes her teeth very thoroughly because she doesn't want cavities. Emma puts on her lucky socks because today is the spelling test. I shared how she'd convinced me to let her paint her bedroom ceiling to look like a night sky, complete with glow-in-the-dark stars that spelled out Emma's room in constellation form. I described the way she'd sing made-up songs while doing her homework, usually about whatever subject she was studying, turning multiplication tables into pop ballads and historical facts into rap verses. Sarah listened to every story with the kind of attention that told me she was gathering these pieces of Emma like treasures, adding them to the brief but profound memory she carried of their encounter. In return, she shared her own memories of that day, details I hadn't known that filled in missing pieces of Emma's final hours. How Emma had mentioned being excited about a school art project where she was painting a portrait of our family dog. How she'd stopped to pet every cat they passed on their walk. How she'd insisted that Sarah make a wish on a dandelion they found, growing through a crack in the sidewalk. She told me that wishes made on dandelions were extra powerful because they were already survivors, Sarah said. She said anything that could grow in concrete deserved to have its magic taken seriously. That was pure Emma, finding profound wisdom in the most ordinary things, treating the world as if it were full of miracles hiding in plain sight. Through Sarah's eyes, I began to see my daughter, not just as the person I'd lost, but as the force of nature she'd been while she was here. The way she'd touched Sarah's life in those brief minutes wasn't an anomaly. It was exactly who Emma had always been, just concentrated into a moment of perfect clarity. The weeks that followed our conversation at the cafe were unlike anything I'd experienced since Emma's death. For the first time in 5 years, I found myself looking forward to something other than sleep or the temporary escape that work provided. Sarah and I began meeting regularly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for walks through the park where Emma had loved to feed the ducks, sometimes just to sit in comfortable silence and remember different versions of the same remarkable person. What struck me most about these encounters was how naturally they evolved. There was no awkwardness, no feeling that we were forcing a connection that shouldn't exist. Instead, it felt like we were two people who had been walking parallel paths in the dark, suddenly discovering we weren't alone. Sarah would tell me stories about her life that Emma had never heard, her struggles with depression, her complicated relationship with her family, her dreams of becoming a teacher, and I would share memories of Emma that Sarah treasured like precious gifts. The transformation in Sarah was remarkable to witness. The hollow-eyed young woman I'd confronted at the farmer's market gradually gave way to someone more vibrant, more present. She started wearing colors other than black and gray. She laughed more easily. The way she touched the necklace changed, too. Instead of the desperate, protective clutching I'd first observed, her fingers would find it in moments of happiness, as if she were sharing good news with an old friend. For my part, I discovered that talking about Emma with someone who understood her impact didn't diminish my memories. It enhanced them. Sarah's perspective illuminated aspects of my daughter's character that I'd never fully appreciated. She helped me see that Emma's final act wasn't just a random kindness extended to a stranger. It was the purest expression of who she'd always been. My daughter had died as she had lived, reaching out to someone who needed her, offering comfort and hope, even when her own time was running out. The guilt that had consumed me for so long began to shift and transform. I realized that I'd been carrying not just the weight of losing Emma, but the burden of believing that her death was senseless, that all her light and love had been snuffed out for nothing. Learning about Sarah changed that entirely. Emma's death was still a tragedy, still a loss that left a hole in the world that could never be filled. But it wasn't meaningless. In her final moments, she had chosen to save a life rather than simply lose her own. One evening in late October, almost 2 months after our first meeting, Sarah called me with an unusual request. She wanted to visit the accident site with me, not the sanitized version that existed now, with new guardrails and fresh asphalt, but the memorial that had grown up around it. I'd avoided that place for years, unable to bear the sight of the flowers and crosses and teddy bears that well-meaning strangers left there. But something in Sarah's voice told me this wasn't about grief tourism or morbid curiosity. This was about completion, about closing a circle that had been left open for too long. We met there just as the sun was setting, the golden light filtering through the trees, in a way that reminded me painfully of Emma's hair. The memorial had grown over the years into something both beautiful and heartbreaking. Dozens of flowers in various stages of bloom and decay, photographs protected by plastic sleeves, handwritten notes from people who had never met my daughter, but whose lives had been touched by her story. Sarah stood beside me in silence for a long time, her hand resting on the necklace. Finally, she spoke. "I used to come here every year on the anniversary," she said quietly. "I would sit right there on that boulder and tell her about my life, about the things I was doing with the gift she'd given me. I always felt like she could hear me." I looked at the boulder she indicated, worn smooth by weather and time, and realized that while I'd been avoiding this place, Sarah had been tending it like a garden. She'd been keeping Emma's memory alive not just in her own heart, but in this physical space where their lives had intersected. "I think she could," I said. And for the first time since Emma's death, I meant it. "I think she's been listening all along." Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, aged and worn from years of handling. "I wrote her a letter every year," she explained. "I was never sure what to do with them, so I just kept them. But now that I've met you, now that I know her father, I think maybe it's time to let them go." She handed me the envelope, and I could feel the weight of 5 years' worth of gratitude, grief, and love contained within. "Would you like me to read them?" I asked. Sarah shook her head. "I wrote them for her. Not for us. But I thought maybe we could leave them here together. Let them become part of this place." We knelt beside the memorial and carefully placed the letters among the flowers and photographs. As we did, I felt something shift inside me. Not the sharp crack of breaking that I'd experienced when Emma died, but something gentler, like a door opening after being locked for years. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like love with nowhere to go. And now, finally, I'd found a place for it. That was 3 years ago now. And as I sit here in my kitchen on this quiet Sunday morning, watching Sarah make pancakes while humming one of the songs Emma used to sing, I'm struck by how grief and joy can occupy the same space in a human heart without canceling each other out. Sarah moved in 6 months after we met, not because either of us was trying to replace what we'd lost, but because we'd both learned that love multiplies rather than divides, that opening your heart to new connections doesn't diminish the ones that came before. She's 24 now, working as a children's librarian and taking night classes to become a social worker. "I want to help kids who feel invisible," she told me once, and I understood that Emma's gift hadn't just been the necklace. It had been showing Sarah that she mattered, that her life had value, that someone could see her worth even in her darkest moment. That single act of recognition had rippled outward in ways Emma could never have imagined, touching not just Sarah's life, but the lives of every child Sarah would go on to help, every family she would counsel, every moment of hope she would kindle in someone else's darkness. The necklace hangs in a frame on our mantel now, next to Emma's photograph and a picture of the three of us that Sarah found among her mother's things. Emma, Sarah, and Sarah's mother, taken on that last day before everything changed. In the photo, Emma is laughing at something off camera, her hand reaching toward Sarah's mother in a gesture of comfort, while Sarah stands slightly behind them both, her young face already showing signs of the strength that would carry her through the years ahead. It's become a kind of shrine, not to death, but to the mysterious ways that love travels through the world, finding its way from heart to heart across time and space. People sometimes ask me if I think it was fate or coincidence that brought Sarah and me together, and I've stopped trying to answer that question. What I know is this: Emma lived 17 years and 43 days, and in that time she learned something about love that I'm still trying to understand. She knew that loving someone doesn't mean holding on to them, but rather helping them become who they're meant to be. She knew that the greatest gifts we can give are often the smallest ones. A moment of attention, a gesture of kindness, the simple act of seeing someone who feels invisible. Every morning when I wake up, I still feel the absence of my daughter like a phantom limb, but I also feel her presence in ways I never expected. She's in Sarah's laugh when she discovers a book she thinks I might like. She's in the way Sarah instinctively reaches for people who are struggling, offering them the same kind of grace Emma offered her. She's in the stories Sarah tells the children at the library, weaving magic and hope into their ordinary Tuesday afternoons. She's in the way we've learned to hold space for both sadness and happiness, understanding that a life fully lived requires room for both. Last week, Sarah came home from work with tears in her eyes, and for a moment, my heart clenched with the old fear that loss would strike again, that happiness was too fragile to trust. But when I asked what was wrong, she smiled through the tears and told me about a little girl at the library whose mother had recently died. She was sitting alone in the children's section, just staring at the books like she couldn't remember how to read, Sarah said. And I thought about Emma, about how she would have known exactly what to do. So I sat down next to her and asked if she wanted me to tell her a story. By the end, she was laughing. That night, as we sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah asked me something she'd never asked before. "Do you think Emma knows?" she said. "About us? About how her gift keeps spreading?" I thought about it for a long time, watching the light fade from gold to pink to purple, listening to the sounds of our neighborhood settling into evening. Children called in for dinner, dogs barking in distant yards, the soft hum of air conditioners and the rustle of leaves in the summer breeze. All of it felt connected somehow, part of the same vast web of ordinary miracles that Emma had always seemed to see so clearly. "I don't know if she knows in the way we understand knowing," I finally said. "But I think love doesn't end just because life does. I think the love we pour into the world keeps working long after we're gone, finding new vessels, creating new connections, touching lives in ways we never could have planned. Emma loved you for 3 minutes, and that love has been growing and spreading for 20 years. It brought you to me, and it's bringing you to every child you help, and it'll bring those children to other people who need what they have to give. That's not fate or coincidence. That's how love works. It multiplies." As I write these words, I can hear Sarah in the next room, talking on the phone with one of her co-workers about a program they're planning for children who've experienced loss. Her voice carries the same gentle confidence that I remember from Emma's voice, the same certainty that broken hearts can heal without losing their capacity for love. She's wearing the necklace today. She puts it on sometimes when she needs to feel connected to something larger than herself. And every time I catch a glimpse of it, I'm reminded that grief transformed into love becomes something powerful enough to change the world. I don't know what Emma would think of the man I've become, of the life Sarah and I have built together, of the way her brief encounter with a stranger in a church parking lot has rippled out to touch so many lives. But I like to think she would recognize the love that drives it all, The same love that made her reach out to a frightened girl on the worst day of both their lives. The same love that compels Sarah to sit with lonely children in library corners. The same love that taught me that letting go doesn't mean forgetting, but rather finding new ways to hold what matters most. The sun is setting now, painting our kitchen golden, and Sarah is asking if I want honey or syrup on my pancakes. Such a simple question, such an ordinary moment, but I've learned that ordinary moments are where the extraordinary lives. This is where love continues, in pancakes on Sunday morning, and bedtime stories, and the choice to keep our hearts open, even when they've been broken. This is where Emma lives now, not in the past where I lost her, but in the present, where her love continues to do its work, one small miracle at a time.